Okay, so this is the Bible on two hands. Old Testament on your left hand, the New Testament on your right hand. It's just a way of, if you could tonight look at your hands, and after tonight you'll look at your hands and go, okay, here's the story of the Bible. Promise you. You got 10 fingers, it's going to make sense. If you can then, when you read the Bible, just kind of figure out, where am I in the Bible? If you know where you are, everything you read is going to make a little bit more sense. So we start with Genesis. We're just going to take a pen and make an arrow pointing down with your left thumb. Because the God of the universe took his power and created, like his power came down into our world and created a world for us. So that's Genesis. It's also kind of symbolic. Forget the direction of the arrow. It was good. And every day God said, it was good. Day 1. Day 2, it was good. Day 3, it was good. Day 4, it was good. Day 5, it was good. Day 6, when he made you, God changed his tune. For the first time, when he made a man and a woman, he said, that's very good. So we're good. But it only lasted for 2 chapters. And then it went, and it was bad. Because and we could make fun and say, well, Eve sinned, so it was all the woman's fault. Yeah, you know what? Adam was right there. Because she handed the fruit to him and said, take a bite. And he did. His problem was passivity. And he didn't lead the way God intended him to. So you don't blame it on Eve. We were both there. We were both complicit. It went from good to bad. The second finger, we're just going to draw an arrow pointing out, just like your finger points out. And that's Exodus. There's actually a lot of pointing in Exodus, where God said to his people, you're going to go to Egypt. That's the tail end of Genesis. But by the time Exodus opens, God has said, go there, live there. They became slaves. And Pharaoh said, go there, work there, you're slaves. And then Moses, the story is a little more complicated, but Moses, on behalf of God, goes back to Egypt and says, Pharaoh, God said, let my people go. He said, no, 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 no. How many times did he say no? The number of times that you have fingers, -1. 9 plagues, 9 times he said no. 10th plague, he said, okay, go. After the death of the firstborn son, Pharaoh said, go. So they did. They left Egypt. And you remember the big story. They get to the body of water called the Red Sea. They can't get across. And so Moses lifts up his staff. The water parts. And they go through on dry ground. And that's the story of Exodus. That was the day that Israel became a nation. Now, this is your largest finger. We're going to hold them all up at the same time for obvious reasons. The largest finger is kind of, this is the big deal of the Bible. And what I want you to do is write the number 10 on your finger. Actually, this Sharpie isn't working. That's a pen, so I'm going to actually get a Sharpie and make this so you can all see it. What does the 10 stand for? Anyone?
Commandments.
The 10 Commandments. And that was, we called it the Old Covenant. The 10 Commandments are the Old Covenant, or what we call the Old Testament. So all of the Old Testament basically revolves around this idea that God has some commands. And he says, here's what you should do. Guess what? They broke the commands. So guess what? They get punished. And that is the story. Everything around, like the temple, the sacrifices, the punishments, all of that is because you didn't do what God told you to do, or you did what God told you not to do. So there's the story so far. Genesis, Exodus, and this actually would include Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and now we're going to go to the ring finger. If you have a ring on your finger, just imagine it's a crown. And that's the story of King David. And so if you can draw just a little 3-pointed crown that looks something like that. So your ring finger, when you look down at your ring, you'll see a crown and you go, oh, that's the kingdom. Why a kingdom? Because law was not enough. They needed a leader in addition to the law. The problem was they didn't have the right leader. It started with Saul, then went to David because Saul screwed up. And after David made some mistakes, but he was the best king of all. So just remember that. David represents the best of what the kingdom has to offer. But after David died, the kingdom was split. It was split with 10 northern tribes, 2 southern tribes. And it wasn't just split, it was conquered. And that's when they had to go into exile. And they were slaves again. They started as slaves, they go back to slaves. So what I'm going to do is just draw 3 little circles. You can draw 2 if you want, I guess, that represent chains. They were in chains. Now I think this works for me because your little finger, and this is actually an amazing bit of biology. The little finger we give little account to because it's just the little finger. We're talking about the period of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. So this is all the prophets. If you're looking at the Old Testament, you've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then you go Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd, like all those big history books. But the prophets are in this period where they're lost. And Israel, which used to be a big deal, is now, like, they're stuffed down. They're captives in Babylon. Even those who stayed in Jerusalem, they're poor. They're beginning to be dispersed. And you think, man, the big deal became a little thing. Here's what's interesting. When you grip something, half of the strength of your grip is in your little finger. So do this experiment right now. Take your hand right now and just squeeze it. Feel the pressure from your little finger. Feel the pressure on your forefinger. Isn't that weird? Like you never think about that. What made Israel great was when they were brought low. Say that again. What made Israel great is when they were brought low. It's in this period, we're talking about 500 BC, clear up through the book of Matthew at the turn of the millennium from BC to AD. That whole period there's very little prophecy between 500 and between Malachi and Matthew, very little prophecy. But it was in this period that they actually developed most of what you think of when you think of Judaism. Like the synagogue, there were no synagogues in the Old Testament. They began that there. Their international policies, they didn't have a lot of that in the Old Testament. It was in this period that they began a lot of it was through Daniel. But all that to say, sometimes when you think you are at your lowest is when you gain your greatest strength through your suffering. Okay, that's the Old Testament. New Testament. I'm right-handed, so this is going to be a little trickier for me. On your pinky, if you could just draw a cross. Because what happened at the opening of the New Testament, and your pinky is Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. God became a man. This great big powerful God became low. He became nothing. And guess what? The greatest strength of God is when he became nothing and came to man. Isn't that good? I just love that. So the whole story of Jesus, his suffering, not just suffering on the cross, although it was a huge part of it, but he became a human being. He lived like us. He experienced hunger. He was born in a stable or laid in a manger. He had weaknesses like we do, like in other words, fatigue. I assume Jesus got sick. I assume he had to learn to walk, to learn to read. I assume he hit his hand with a hammer in his dad's workshop. He became nothing. The greatest thing Jesus ever did, and if he didn't do this, you would never know about him, is he gave his life for us on a cross. He literally became nothing, and that was his greatest strength. Now, after the Gospels, we're going back to a ring finger. Jesus was crowned. Now, before you do this crown, because it's got to make sure the symbol makes sense. When was Jesus inaugurated? When did he become king?
Well, Acts
On the cross.
It was. It's actually at his ascension.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
And the New Testament talks about that. It wasn't when he died. And the book of Hebrews says something really interesting, that Jesus learned, he gained, and I forget the exact wording, but he gained perfection, or he gained his position because he learned submission. That's a huge lesson. So what I'm going to use for this is just a circle. And you go, a circle, like that means nothing. It means zero, exactly. That's the resurrection. When Jesus rose from the dead, he ascended to heaven and became crowned the King of the Jews. Up until that point, he had not been enthroned. So that was his inauguration.
It's almost when he completed the circle, is that what you mean?
I love that. Yeah, but that's another meaning. Thank you. That's a good meaning to the circle. So he comes full circle. He came to earth, went to heaven. This can represent the resurrection. There is no bigger deal for Jesus. Like if Jesus just died for you, you are not saved. And the Bible says that it was his resurrection that validated his death, his resurrection that gave life. So Jesus' death, okay, he could pay for your penalty, but it's his resurrection that gives you life. So that's like the big deal. So he is now king. And that's the book of Acts. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. Okay? The largest finger of your hand, just like the other one was the biggest deal of the Old Testament, the biggest deal of the New Testament is grace. And I'm going to ask you to write the letter L and the number 2. I'm going to try to do that. And then I'll tell you, can anybody guess what that stands for? L2. L2. In the new covenant, in Jesus' kingdom, he has 2 laws.
Oh, love.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbors yourself. So if you ever want to know what's a Christian's obligation like, what are we supposed to do? Love God, love people. That's it. I may not use this with the students, but I want to share this with you. Do any of you know how many commands there were in the Old Testament? There was the 10 Commandments that was the basis of the law, but they added more to it. 613. 613 laws. You know what the counter of that is? 316. Not 613, 316. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. That's what we call the gospel. This is such a big deal, and it's your biggest finger in how we live. It's the biggest deal that God loved us, so we love him and we can love others. No other religion teaches that. Every other religion says you get to God by obeying God and earning your way to him. Whether that's knocking on doors or passing out tracts or killing other people or whatever the religion says. Ours is the only religion, literally the only religion that says you are saved by what God did for you, not by what you do for him. It's an incredible statement. So L2, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Because instead of 613 commands that we used to have, we have John 3:16, that God so loved the world. Now, because of that, I'm going to ask you just to draw an arrow on your right hand as a response, not to earn our salvation, as a response. What's the last thing that Jesus said?
Made gospel.
Go into all the world, make disciples of all nations. Go, 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 go. And so that's why we have mission trips, and that's why we share the gospel. That's why we build churches. We are going into all the world to make disciples. And that is, so we've seen Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts. I would say this is captured by the book of Romans. It is the doctrine of grace. And then this is everything past Romans except for one book, the book of Revelation. And I want you to make an arrow going up on your thumb when we go to heaven. Or more specifically, we go to a new heaven and a new earth in a new body.
It's gonna get all these tattoos on my finger.
Are we gonna be skinny or fat?
That would be a cool one.
Okay, now all right, you ready? Everybody hold up your hands. And now I want you to do something. Just take a moment.
Totally.
You don't even need to talk to anybody. Just do this. And tell the story of the Bible. Genesis to Revelation. You go to slavery, you go to free people. There is 10 commandments. We've replaced them with 2. We have a kingdom of David that was imperfect. We have a kingdom of Jesus that is perfect. We have the suffering of Israel in the Old Testament and the suffering of Jesus in the New Testament.
Wow. Oh my goodness, I'm getting chills.
Definitely get it.
It's a cool idea.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've never heard.
Not on the my fingers, though.
Dear.
What do you think?
Who thought of it?
It's cool.
I thought of it. Do you like it?
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah.
What about for our toast?